Hi, everyone. Welcome to Queer History Boston's event. Tonight we're talking with Alice Friedman, the author of Queer Moderns. Welcome so much. Well, thanks everyone for being here. I'm just going to start with plugging a few things for Queer History Boston. Hi, my name is Matisse. I'm Director of Engagement and Advancement. Just want to say hi and welcome. Just going to put a couple things in the chat, some websites, things like that. Here's our website, queerhistoryboston.org, freshly redone. We recently changed our name this fall from the History Project to Queer History Boston. Take a look there. I just want to also shout out our Instagram. If you like photos, we try to share most days little photos around Boston local queer history. Um, I'm also going to do one more little plug for us. It is our sort of end of year time. So, and we are a small community archives. If you feel moved, I'm just going to put here a little link if you want to donate to help keep things running and the lights on. Much appreciated. But we're here to talk about queer history. We're here to talk about Alice and queer moderns and Max Ewing. So I'm gonna introduce Alice now. Where did it go? Did I closed the link? That's all right. Um,
Would you like
I'll
me to introduce myself?
honestly, please, Alice, take it away. My spiel. I clicked the wrong button.
If
I
you
closed it.
closed your notes, then
Alice, please go ahead and take us away.
hi everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Alice Friedman, and I'm an art historian and an architectural historian. And I retired from teaching at Wellesley College 2 years ago. Um, and I wrote a number of books about gender in architecture and sexuality in architecture. And I was in the middle of writing or researching another one at Yale about architecture and how expats in Paris lived, particularly queer and unconventional households, for a book called Poker Faces. Um, and then I, by accident, discovered Max Ewing, and that was the end of that for the last, mm, for at least 5 years, but it included COVID.
Mhm.
And the library at Yale was closed for 2.5 years to outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with Max, right? And how I feel like Max Ewing, in a lot of ways, is like this unexpected portal into like queer modern life, modern in the sort of the like like academic era sense, right? Of like the sort of early mid 20th century. So yeah, how did you find him, and what hooked you about Max Ewing, and how did he become like the thread of how you're pulling at this era in time? Like, just
Yep.
paint us a picture. How did you find Max?
Well, um, I found Max, as I said, by accident because I was researching domestic arrangements and apartment houses in Paris that were uh, occupied usually by expats. It's a way of staying anonymous. So it's a book called Poker Faces. And I, the library couldn't find something that I was hoping to look at. So I had read about Max. He appears in other books because he wrote so many letters describing everything he wrote, everything he experienced and who he met and what they wore and what they ate. So he was born in 1903 in Pioneer, Ohio, which is 60 miles west of Toledo, with very little in between this tiny town of Pioneer and Toledo, and then on to Ann Arbor, where he ended up, and then eventually New York. But I thought, oh, well, I have a little chance to look at some of the papers that Max left behind. He wrote to his parents at least twice a week for 10 years and all those letters were preserved by Carl van Vechten, his friend, after he died. He died at the age of 31. So it was a clear project with a lifespan. And so I requested some of the letters and I requested some of the photo albums that are basically the core of this book because I am an art historian. It's a portrait of an era through letters and photographs. Because Max is, Matisse just mentioned that Max would, if he had been alive today, would have been an influencer.
Oh, yes.
Um, if he'd had the right media, because he wanted to be part of everybody's life and everything and get people interested in the things he was interested in and then be part of things. Um, and I just could not believe his photo collections and his letters and the details and the nude male photos and pictures and letters about all these people that I had been researching in Paris in the 1920s. And it was like a dream come true because I'd always wondered like what the inside of people's apartments. And he describes them to his mother, the color schemes. And of course, there wasn't color photography. So that was all really cool. And so I basically put everything else aside and followed Max.
Okay, I love this. So you're looking at research into apartments and expats, and you discover this character. Kathy in the chat asks, "And who is he? Who is
Yeah.
Max Ewing?"
Who
I
is
love
he?
that. And who is he?
He is not like he's important for us because he left a huge queer archive. And his friend, the writer and photographer Carl Van Vechten, preserved it after Max died. Um, Van Vechten was once described as the librarian's dream prince. And that's because he kept everything, cataloged everything, photographed everyone. He took 9,000 portraits of his friends. And so his archive of photos is an amazing record of African American writers, entertainers, poets, whoever. Um, and Van Vechten was an important part of this story. But going back to why I couldn't stop, I couldn't look away, was I was trying to write about lesbian couples in particular. And lo and behold, Max Ewing knew Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas. That they were some of the first people he visited when he got to Paris. And of course, his letters are always detailed and they're always very, very gossipy. Um, so what Alice wore and who else was at the parties and what she cooked. And so I was like, this is amazing stuff. And then he was also friends with the two ladies who had been a couple were the editors of the Little Review, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, both of whom were photographed by the photographer Berenice Abbott. So these are all people I knew really well. And then Max just said to his mother, "Oh, Margaret Anderson is just so great. She always wears these vivid colors, and her apartment has lights that come up from below and have like blue and green lampshades and all that sort of stuff is catnip to a person like me."
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's what happened. Does that answer your question, Kathy? Okay, good. That's who he is.
He was
A lot
African
of people
American,
he's American. He was born in Pioneer, Ohio.
African American or white?
White. He's white. And so if you look at this book cover, there he is, lying down, reading Cocteau. I mean, that's so Max, right? Take a picture of me reading my favorite book. And I he was very good friends with the queer photographer George Platt Lynes, um, who did a lot of ballet and theater and nude, queer nude men photos. George Platt Lynes is the subject of this book by my friend Nick Mouse, co-author Angela Miller. And it turns out that these photos of Max that are on the cover were some of the earliest images that George Platt Lynes ever took when he was just learning to take photos. So that was really fun. And Lynes is more famous. Max tried a lot of different media, but he really is an influencer. He had no medium, really. He tried a lot of different ones. And he actually wrote to his cousin and said, I pick up all these things like photography and try them and I do well in them. And I'm not an artist, so I lose interest and move on to the next thing. So you could say he was um, superficial or he had a short attention span. but he was part of this. The modern piece of it is that he was part of a movement in New York and in Paris that was queer and straight together and uh, was an experiment in interracial sociability and writing. And he had many Black friends as part of his circle. And he created a queer space for himself in his apartment that was the sort of the core of his being as an entertainer, as a person who entertained and facilitated conversation with other people about changing art and changing literature and changing dance and changing photography. And that's what makes them modern. In the 1920s, we always think of people like Picasso um, and all these men, straight men. And this book is really about how straight white men are not the only people who um, pushed and advanced and made art in a modern way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's who he is.
He's also sort of from as I was reading the book, he seems like this sort of like kind of party boy dandy, also kind of floating around. His time in New York, his time in Paris. Um, he seems like I was like as I was saying, like as I was reading this, I couldn't help but feel like I was looking at someone who would have made it huge on TikTok today if they were alive. You know what I mean? Like, uh,
Yep.
he he was very social. He went around. He was. I remember reading the part where he's writing home to his mother about all the parties and the luncheons he's been going to. Very social, while also I don't know if I was. It felt the same. Also, sort of like he was almost living beyond what he was even like his means because he was so enamored with like people and just sort of living life with. I don't know. Tell me more about your experience of Max and what you discover about him in this sort of yeah, like was he a socialite? What was he trying to do? What was his life like in this way?
Well, he came to New York to be a concert pianist,
Yes.
right? So that I mentioned the one medium that he was very disciplined in and kept with until he injured his finger. Um, and it's typical of Max that he injured his finger in a performance of one of the great modernist artworks and music and artworks called the Ballet Mécanique, where the pianists, there were, I think, 9 of them, they were banging, banging, banging on the pianos, and there were gongs and propellers and sirens and all this sort of stuff. But he came to New York in order to be a concert pianist. So ostensibly, he was trying to socialize with influencers, let's say, and patrons who would help him in his career.
Hmm.
But which he did, and he was very appealing. He was very attractive. Um, he was very well educated. He made a point of being like the most educated person in Pioneer, Ohio. And, so that made him an outsider in the cultural sense. But he um, he was someone who also got very much involved with the queer world of New York, right? He started socializing and going to parties and salons with a purpose, but one of that was to meet people and advance his career. But the other purpose of his socializing was to meet other queer people, right? And he was a, very, very good musician. And one of the things he did was write popular music for this review, Downtown Review, that was a parody of Broadway that came out every year called the Grand Street Follies. And through the Grand Street Follies, he met cross dressers and comedians and comic actresses and um, fashion models and like a whole world of people that where he was at home. He felt at home with that group of people. And those people came when he came back from Europe. So that was the beginning of his time. Then he went to Europe in 1926 and 27. And when he came back, he basically turned his large studio apartment into queer space for entertaining, for art performances, for music, for dancing. And then the big thing he did was he made a gallery of portraits in his walk-in closet.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a gorgeous the photo gallery wall is so um uh stunning, honestly. And I also really loved that you used it as a portal into like 1920s queer fascination and who people were into and what they wanted to know, who they wanted to know about. Yeah, are you showing us a picture?
yeah, I was going to just show this picture. I don't know if it shows, but that's Max in his gallery um, of, he called it the Gallery of Extraordinary Portraits. And it was photographs and clippings of all the celebrities, uh, queer heroes um, that he knew or people he wished he knew also, because he had this very active imagination. And so you could see, I think, I'll show you on the PowerPoint in a second. Um, he numbered all of these 200 images, little clippings and photographs, and then he made a catalog. He printed a catalog so people could, look at the photographs and see who they were looking at. And Kathy just asked another question that's important. He, so one of the reasons that he wrote to his parents so frequently is they were a very tight-knit group, little trio. He was an only child. They were back in Pioneer. They were in a dry goods store. And his career was their main preoccupation, and they supported him quite well. He was a lot richer than his artists and actor friends, always. Um, but he would write to them and say, I really need a new suit if I'm going to go to the best parties and the best dinners. And they would say, sure, sure, sure. And his mother, because she was in the dry goods business, was both parents were very involved with fashion. They like to keep up with Hollywood. They like to keep up with fashion. So he had money thanks to his parents, and they paid his rent and they paid him an allowance.
Though I remember there was letters where he's like trying to also like run business himself and talking about how, hey, you parents, I like you didn't get successful until your 30s. I'm just turning 30, like I'm so close. Like it's interesting because they're financing him, but he's also trying to be an entrepreneur and a businessman in his own right, it seemed. It's an interesting
He
I
was
thought
an entrepreneur about his career.
yeah, it was an interesting tension of like he's being financed while also like he still is like realizing that this isn't forever and I need to figure out how to make my own money at some point too. It was
Yes.
interesting, right?
Yes. And then that was one of the reasons that he spiraled down after his parents died, because he felt like he was completely, this also answers Kathy's question, completely incapable of dealing with money himself. He was never ever going to run that dry goods store in Pioneer, Ohio. He couldn't bear, he had vowed he would never go back there. But when his parents died, he went back to settle their estates. Uh, and that's what sent him in the middle of winter, in the middle of Ohio, in the middle of farm country, in the middle of a town where everyone thought he was, you know, an odd
Yeah.
ball.
I and Kathy's asking also how did he know he was gay or how did we know he was gay? As I was reading this, it is fascinating. He's very clearly got a lot of relationships to men. And it also sounds like he has a lot of really interesting intimate relationships with women as well. Maybe it's not so cut and dry like gay versus straight, especially this sort of modern world he's living in. Will you talk to us more about this sort of like
Well, his sexual affinities were all with men, and his romantic
mm,
affinities were all with men. Um, but he had very close women friends. Not surprisingly, I mean, we all know people of that type. Um, and it's a very interesting question because he knew he was different, right? He was a, a very different intellectually, in terms of his interests. And he would often write to his parents and say things like, "Remember how you wanted me to go to baseball games and wanted me to be more like everyone else, but I spent my time reading books, and now look at me. I have all these intellectual artist friends in New York, and it paid off, right? That's who I am." But very early on, so he never writes about sex, but he often writes about his emotional life and his crushes on men. And that person, the cross-dresser, the beautiful cross-dresser, who played women's roles uh, in the Grand Street Follies, whose name was Albert Carroll. And Max was very, very close to him. But before he left for Europe, he wrote to his parents. I'll just read it to you. It's really quite cool. So I'll read what I wrote and then what he wrote. I said, "Clearly nothing and no one would ever come between him and his ambitions. His description of his parting with Albert Carroll, the Grant Street Follies actor, in early February 1926 is a case in point. He wrote to his parents with remarkable candor about his fading feelings for Carroll, telling them that there had been an embarrassing scene about his upcoming trip to Europe. And here's the quote. It is very strange to have had a very deep and very poignant and very personal and very great feeling about someone," he explained. "And then to find after a period of time that absolutely every trace of that feeling has vanished. And that, remember, he's 24, and that no feeling of any kind remains for that person." And he's telling this to his parents. "And they might as well be anyone at all. A year and a half ago, it was very important, almost necessary to me to see and listen to and be with Albert Carroll. And that last night he was just a young man who happened to be in the room. And that it made not the least difference to me whether he stayed or went. I made that clear to him, and he said he was going to weep, and I suggested that he go before that. Max could be cold. He went on his knees and begged me not to go to Europe. I made it clear that nothing he could do would keep me from sailing. And it was all very trying," he said to them. So he's very clearly aware of his feelings and his sexuality. But he is, I think, the big conundrum with Max Ewing, because he's most of the letters are to his parents, but some of them are to his intimate friend, this woman called Muriel Draper. And he doesn't, I mean, she was a very sexual person, very sexually active person. So he could very easily have said to her, "Oh, I went to bed with this one or that one." But he doesn't. And I think he's one of those people for whom style and self-possession is more important than intimacy and sexual intimacy. He's intimate in a way with people, but there's absolutely no reason to believe, for me to believe. But he certainly took a lot of pictures of beautiful nude athletes and actors and dancers. So, he liked looking, he liked talking, he liked feeling, but I don't think he liked dropping his cool, letting go of his beads, or what it is, ever it is, dropping his beads or being vulnerable. He didn't like being vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah, you have a great section too where you talk about how he loved his celebrities and the people he admired, and it didn't always translate to his real life love life. How there were many people he was infatuated with, had crushes with, but it didn't like make this like long connection. Yeah, he's just such I think he's such a fascinating figure. But I want to just pivot like away from Max and into sort of like his world. I once again, that this sort of photo closet. Once again, it's so amazing that he has a
Should we
literal.
look at it for a second?
Yes. Let's look at it. He has this closet full of portraits. And in this book, you have a chapter about all of the people who are represented in it, right? All of uh, the figures of this time. It's such a excellent portal, like literally portal it through the sort of a closet door. And it's also amazing that it's a closet, isn't it? You know, right? It's sort
Yeah.
of
Yep.
like so talk to me more about the people that you discovered in there and what you learned about life in 1920s queer New York, you know? The queer modern New York.
Well, here are the pictures of two of his friends from the Grand Street Folly, Albert Carroll and his friend Eileen McMahon, who went on to be, she was in lots of Hollywood movies and got quite well to do. Um, but there's Max in the gallery that he created, and you can see it was a little walk-in closet. It was 4 feet by 4 feet. Um, and I just have a couple of slides to show who some of these folks are. Um, the Harlem dancer, entertainer, Adelaide Hall. She's there. And then Oscar Wilde and Boise, his lover.
We're not
And
seeing any pictures.
you can't see the screen?
No, there's no pictures being shown.
Oh,
I can, so
I
you might
can.
have to
Oh,
switch
it's just
switch
you,
the
Kath.
view.
Um, so most people can
Here's
see him?
Yeah,
Okay.
At the top, you should see a button that says view, and you can change the view to make sure that the speaker is visible. So that way you should be able to see it.
You got it? Oh, I guess you can look at the book.
The book,
side by side gallery. Try that, Kathy.
So I'll just keep soldiering on here because there are two images of his favorite bodybuilder, this guy, Anthony Sansone. And, we have to remember that these are very risque images, right? And he loved that. Max loved being risque. But up here, for example, I mean, I could go on and on, but he has photos of Proust. And then the thing that blew me away was he was good friends with the photographer Berenice Abbott. And, I've spent a lot of time looking at the portraits of lesbians that she did in Paris in the 1920s, 26, 27. And Max has them tacked up on the wall with a lot of them with thumbtacks. It's like not archival. And so they're up here. There's Cocteau, actually, the one of Abbott's pictures of him with the gun. So all of that is very cool. And then he kept adding to this display, and he kept amending, putting in addenda to the catalog, this catalog that he printed himself on exhibition in Gallery 19 West 31st Street, New York City. And so he kept adding to it and changing it. So the later iterations have actually Gary Cooper, Mae West she was there from the start because she did a number of queer themed plays, which most of us don't have any idea about that. I didn't. There's a picture of Cecil Beaton in drag down here. And so it's interesting to see that photographer who became such a huge fashion photographer and the photographer to the royal family, again, like George Platt Lyons, really early in his career, being a friend of Max's. And here's Radcliffe Hall, right, the author of The Well of Loneliness, whose book was the subject of a court case right then and there, right? So it's very contemporary and topical. And Max, sorry, that was it. I wanted to just show you a little bit of it before we move on. This picture down here, that's how I could date it, because his friend Van Vechten, who's this guy here, who did all these self-portraits, and was Max's mentor. There he is in his pajamas, there he is in his robe, there he is in his evening clothes. These are all self-portraits by Van Vechten from 1932. And Van Vechten did a picture of the beautiful cabaret performer Paul Mears, also in 1932. So that's how I was able to date that particular image. It had to be post 32. And Max left New York for Hollywood in 1933. And then he died in 1934. So, and the reason, Kathy, you asked this question, how do we know so much about him? When he left New York, he packed everything up really carefully in folders and labeled them in accordion files. He's also an archivist, and put it in storage, and then didn't return to New York. Right, he died in in upstate New York. So there a lot of this was intact, and his friend Carl Van Vechten, the librarian's dream prince of archivists, made sure every letter that he'd ever written came back to the archives. He implored people to look in their bureau drawers and their desks, and so a lot of the letters were in Max's parents' collection because they kept everything he ever wrote. But a lot of them, Van Vechten had worked very hard to create this archive, and he was very aware, Van Vechten, that he was creating a queer archive, right? And that's the other thing that's so interesting because, the question is who preserves queer history, especially for our topic tonight, for our group tonight. And so it's very important, both his archive and Van Vechten's. So Van Vechten also did these self-portraits, which are in the book. We talk about Max's clothes and Max dressing up in different identities. And Van Vechten, was absolutely into that himself. In this, and they both, because of the time, the absolute heartthrob of this, the sexiest queer figure was the sailor. Mm. They loved sailors. They loved the idea of sailors. Van Vechten was sexually active, and he picked up sailors, and the lady friends of theirs went down to bars and danced with sailors. And so here he is in a sailor pants and a sailor shirt, holding a little stuffed white cat, really camp, right? And I'll stop after this pair. We can go back to questions. Max Ewing, to a lesser extent, Van Vechten to a greater extent, was very, very close friends with Langston Hughes. And he somehow managed, Van Vechten, to get Langston and other men to take off their shirts. So this is Van Vechten, could take pictures of them. And these are really early photos of Langston. Langston, I think, is in the gallery in a clipping, but, in 1932, Van Vechten took pictures of him. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can talk about more things. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, actually, I am curious about like Van Vechten and Ewing, and they lived in Harlem, right? And
No, they lived in, Max lived on 31st Street on the east side, just past Fifth Avenue, west 31st, 19 West 31st Street. And Van Vechten, when he first met Max, lived in the downtown. And then he had an apartment that was a big scale version of what Max did in his studio, which had Van Vechten was very well to do because his brother died and left him all his money. He was a writer and a critic and a fairly ordinary guy financially up until that point. But then he and his wife, because he was also married, had this very large apartment on, I think it's West 56th Street, which was, party central, discussion groups, performances, musical performances,
Mm,
Bessie Smith, all these friends of theirs
mhm,
who they met on their walkabouts and drinkabouts in Harlem,
mhm.
um, were
So
there.
these figures like participated in like either tangentially or directly with like the Harlem Renaissance, where they were like friends.
Absolutely, they are the core of the Harlem Renaissance.
Mm,
And what Van Vechten is best known for, besides the certain behaviors that got him his terrible reputation, what he's actually that he's known by some people as a racist because he wrote a book with the N word in the title. Um, but he um, he was one of the major promoters of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. He used his white privilege and power to promote other writers and other music by African American friends. Um, and that was a fairly substantial piece of his legacy. That and the photographs, right? If there's anybody you want to know what they looked like from the 1930s right to the 60s when Van Vechten died, it chances are very good that Van Vechten took a picture of them
mm,
in his home studio.
mhm. Yeah, I it was really interesting hearing about Van Vechten and like just such a contentious figure and yeah, his that sort of like closeness of like, a lot of white queer people with closeness to blackness and the is it fetishization? Is it this appreciation? Is it an elevation?
Yep.
It's this very murky
Oh,
area that
yep.
it was interesting to like to dig into it in your book and to encounter it and grapple
Well,
with it.
it's a it's something to be grappled with,
Yes.
right? And not necessarily answered, but grappled with in terms of the sort of endemic racism,
Mhm.
but also his commitment to his friends and other writers and to African American culture. This is Van Vechten, and Max went along to do that, um, and was interested and followed along. But I actually learned an enormous amount from the literary critic and historian Emily Bernard, who wrote about Langston and Van Vechten. Um, and in, she has a really interesting take on this issue of his racism because she teaches at classes at UVM and to undergraduates about race and language.
Mhm.
And her take on Van Vechten, who she adores,
Mhm.
was that he used the N word in his title because he thought he was cool.
Mhm.
And he thought he was as cool as his black friends. And as Emily put it, he used the one word no white man should use,
Yes.
which is absolutely true. But he messed up in a big, big way because a bunch of his friends, and I write about this in the book,
Mhm.
his black friends and acquaintances said, chuck that damn thing right out. It's crap. Right?
Yeah.
It was bad news. He's controversial.
Yeah. I mean, it's just once again, you find Max Ewing in his world, and it's just such a lens into the time, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything about this era and how, yeah, the closeness of like these interracial communities through like meeting over queerness and art and the tensions there. It's something to really grapple with in the past and the history that we're dealing with. Yeah.
Well, and it was so ephemeral, right? Because both the so-called pansy craze of the 20s and the relative leniency of public culture and the interracial experiment, let's call it,
Hmm.
during the Depression and as the 30s went along, all of that shut down
Hmm.
gradually and then completely,
Hmm.
right? And to the racist, homophobic world of the 30s and 40s and the 50s, um, and the world that we know. So it was even more important to me to look at this community in New York and Hollywood, and the relative pride, let's say freedom, but also sense of identity that these people had, relative,
Yeah.
right?
Um, I'm going to just everyone. We're going to pivot to audience Q&A soon. If you want to start thinking of any more questions that you've got, I before we do that, I just want to plug once again. Here is the link to the book, and the good folks at Princeton University Press have given us a little code. If you're thinking about getting this book, which I highly recommend, it is a really great read and really once again such a great portal into this world while also being this amazing character study of this figure, this artist. Uh, it's really such a special book that you've created, Alice. But
Thank
once
you.
again, here's the link. There's a special discount code if you want to use it. It's right there. Just putting it out there. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A. I'm curious, Alice, what do you hope readers of your book carry forward, not just about Max, but about how we think about queer history, and how does that translate into what we should pay attention to, like in our world around us today? Because everything today will be history one day, right?
Yeah,
So how do
yeah.
you yeah, tell us about how you think about queer history and what you learned about queer history and your perspective on it while writing this book.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the book, to me, was the importance for Max Ewing of the queer space that he created, a safe space, but also an intense, interactive cultural space where without shame, right? A space without shame, very, very briefly. Um, but, and one of the more, the takeaways of the book is how much he suffered without that, right? He had to go back to Pioneer. And there he was in the middle of the farm country, in the middle of the Midwest, where people thought he was a deviant. And he was such a sensitive person. It took its toll, right? He spiraled down and down and down. But another thing that has been pointed out to me, and I think it's a really good takeaway, because when he was in the Midwest, he thought that when he left, he had so many friends. And one thing that was mentioned to me, and I thought it was really useful, was that one of the takeaways is the people should be able to tell real friendship from superficial sociability. People that you meet at the bar, people that you go out with for drinks, people that you see, in fashion context. Those are not going to be the people who sustain you. Um, and, even Van Vechten was so into his own photo projects that he wasn't really there for Max either, and let alone all these other folks that he hung out with. So that was one of the takeaways about queer culture is build capacity, build community. Don't let yourself become isolated and depressed, because Max, it was a huge loss. I mean, as a historian, was born in 1903. There were people alive in the 80s that were 80 and 85 and whatnot who were Max's contemporaries. And he was so long gone. He had disappeared from the earth a long time before that. And it was shocking to me in a way. And it just makes it more poetic that he had this brief, beautiful life.
Yeah. Yeah, because at the end, when he ended up having to go home to take care of his parents when they died, he only had one friend who really came and like was there with him, right? He wrote to all his friends, like, and even his best friend Muriel wrote him back, being like, "Don't kill yourself. I'll come visit one day." And
Yeah.
it came too late. Like it's this
Yeah.
really tragic story of like the superficiality of queer city life, and yeah, he only had one friend who came back to like take care of him while he was really struggling. That yeah.
Yes, and the friend was a boxer that he knew who in the scrapbooks where Van Vechten saved some of Max's photos of the boxer because it was very beautiful. He captioned it with decoupage collage captions, and he referred to Jack Pollock as trade, and Max, Max recognized that they weren't really the same sort of person in terms of education, but Jack, they loved each other a lot, and Jack took care of him. Right. And then when Max died, they all rejected Jack and said, that was then, this is now, we really aren't your friends.
Yeah, this is Max's like extended family.
Yeah. And his friends in New York, because Jack couldn't stop crying, of course. And he felt so awful that he had let this happen, that Max had killed himself on his watch, so to speak. And but the last chapter is really hard to read because he was very much rejected by the New York friends. He was they took him up as a kind of curiosity, that boxer, and then when push came to shove, they were like, nah, we're not in you anymore.
Yeah. The fickleness of queer community, you know what I mean? Then and now.
Yeah, I guess so. And but also just the difficulties of being without your supports.
Yes.
And one of his supports, he had people who were somewhat supported him, but one of the things that really supported him was the queer space itself.
Yes.
The space that he created.
Yeah. Okay, we have some questions already. So everyone, if you have more, please think of them and please feel free to either put them in chat or you can raise your hand and unmute and come ask questions. That's very, very much welcome. But Mitchell has asked, I'm in New York City. Do you know exactly where the Grand Street Follies performed?
I do. I have the address, but you can look it up on Google. It's downtown on Grant Street in the earliest days. And it started out as part of as a kind of amateur theatricals in one of the settlement houses. And then it got bigger and bigger, and downtown became a thing that Max, just like today, where the people came there. And then it actually, towards the end of the decade, it moved to Broadway, the show, the Grand Street Follies, briefly. But it was basically a parody by all these comedians and camp actors of Broadway characters. And Aline McMahon, about whom there's this amazing biography, because she went on to a career in Hollywood, was one of the best comedic actresses at parodying, some of the singers and some of the tragic actresses that on the stage. And she just, made people laugh. So they were downtown on Grand Street.
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. I can kind of bring you up.
Anything else? Are there other questions in the chat, Matisse? Because I haven't been looking at the chat. No more questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
Alice, I'm just sort of curious about your sense of the ways in which lesbians and gay men interacted and whether, I mean, not to be too stereotypical, but there is a certain stereotype among gay men of being a bit kind of superficial or, whatever, and lesbians as being slightly less humored and more loyal, perhaps. So I don't know, back in the time, was there a lot of interaction or?
Well, the people that he was friends with, the lesbians he was friends with, had a lot of, sort of social capital and money. And the other thing I should mention, the other thing that Max Ewing did um, was he did a photo project um, starting in 1932 called the Carnival of Venice.
Yes.
And I discuss it in the book, but in that 70 portrait group of photos, there are quite a few, not a lot, but a handful of portraits of his lesbian friends. But, they were just passing through. One of them was the boat racer and a huge heiress, very wealthy, called Joe Carstairs. And one of them was her girlfriend. And then there were all of these other people. But, I think the core of his community was men, and he had lesbian friends. That's probably the best way to put it.
Mm.
They weren't particularly loyal to him either, but they were also into their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have fun writing this book?
Did I have what?
Fun writing this book?
I did. I had a lot of fun. It was an obsession. And in the introduction, I said that basically my partner and I and our friends cohabited with Max Ewing for 5 years, and he was very much a part of this family
Uh-huh.
because he was very alive to me in terms of what he had written and who he was. And it was hard to write, right? Because there's so many people that I've never heard of, and most
Uh-huh.
people haven't heard of anymore. And so I had to do a kind of glossary of gazetteer of names at the back of the book. So you could, keep track of who people were. But so it was hard to write, but it was also fun to write because it was so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a while to wrap my head around the fact that people would always say, well, look, you're an architectural historian, you write about buildings. How come you wrote about this guy? And the answer, ultimately, one of the answers is he was fascinating, and I'm an interdisciplinary kind of historian, cultural historian. But the other thing is, it was really interesting to see this queer space that he created around him and what that meant, and what it meant to have it and what it meant to lose it.
Yeah.
And that I think because that was one of the takeaways, right? You gotta not only build community, but make spaces yours, like, for example, as women centers, women focused spaces, gay focused spaces, where they're not just safe, but they're imbued with our culture and our ways of being, I guess is a way to put it. And that, people take for granted. And, in this time, we can't take anything for granted.
So true.
Right.
Terry asks in the chat, please share some info about his relationship with Stein and Tolkis.
So by the time he got over there in the 1920s, they were an institution in Paris. Their apartment and their salon and the way they entertained. And also, their apartment and the salon was a place that it was sort of on the list of places that you had to go. It was a pilgrimage site for people who were interested in modernism and queer culture. So George Platt-Lyons, when he was like barely 20, the first thing he went when he got to Paris was their apartment. And that was true for a lot of queer men. And Max, within the first week he was there, he was over there and writing to his parents and saying, Gertrude really likes me. She says I can come over anytime. So it was like fascinating to me that they kept up this nightly salon that it's part of legend of modernism. But it was also one of the things about in the legend of modernism was that it was also a pilgrimage site for gay men. I found out through my other work that they were part of a lesbian community, but they didn't play well with others, and they were a little bit older. than Max and his friends, Margaret Anderson, Jane Heap, Solita Solano, all these people who were modern figures in the 20s. So they went to lunch with the snooty, wealthier ladies uh, who had houses out in the suburbs, who were all lesbians. They were part of this lesbian crew that had its own rules and culture.
Mhm. I just want to start winding us down. I want to say, Alice, thank you so much
It's a
for
pleasure.
being here and sharing about your book. I want to once again, everyone, if you have a chance, please feel free to order yourself a copy. It is really a treat to read. Once again, it's this phenomenal character study while also being this portal into life. And so
Thank you.
it's a really fun read, y'all. So get yourself a copy. And I just want to say, Alice, thank you again so much for spending some time together. And
Oh,
really,
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I should also mention that it's on a discounted holiday 100 list at a Harvard bookstore.
hey,
So you could also get it at Harvard bookstore. They have copies on hand. At better to give them your business than Amazon, for example.
yes.
Anyway,
Um,
thank you so much, Matisse. This was fun.
yes, thank you so much. And Richard, uh, there's much more to learn about Max in California. Get yourself a copy of the book. But thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you have a great night. And thanks,
Thanks.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.